you must at some point in time in your life have decided that it was good to be a little bit different, a little bit eccentric, to always dress in a suit, to speak in a certain way. I just wonder when that was.
I think a not decision is not necessarily a decision, if you see what I mean. That I never decided to be different, but that doesn't mean that I took a conscious decision that I would carry on as I was. I just did carry on as I was. And I basically always wear a suit because I'm lazy. It's just very easy to wear a suit. You don't have to worry about what you're supposed to be wearing the next day.
You see, people often think of you as this sort of old-fashioned aristocrat. And you're not an aristocrat,
No,
are you?
I'm not, no. My family have been living in Somerset for a very long time as farmers and businessmen.
So how much of your politics comes from your father, who was editor of the Times?
Oh, a great deal of my politics comes from my father. He was a very important influence in my life growing up and in my political career.
To what extent? I mean, because we all, a lot of us sort of absorb the politics of our parents and sort of, often end up rejecting it. You sort of took it on, if anything.
Well, politics was a major part of family discussion. It was something my father was often talking about. My father had a very, to my mind, attractive view of the world. He thought that the individual was very important. He believed in what you might call our ancient liberties and thought that they were worth protecting. He was very influenced by John Locke, and in this sense he was slightly more of a Whig than an old-fashioned Tory. He also was interested in ideas, which perhaps is safer territory for a journalist sometimes than a politician. And he recognized that as a journalist, his job, every time he wrote a column, was to be interesting and therefore to be in a position to provoke and encourage discussion. And that led to a very interesting upbringing because we were always discussing whatever the political issue of the day was, and to think it through and be willing to come to the conclusion that actually what you thought a year before was wrong this year.
I mean, you must have spent your childhood meeting politicians.
Oh,
and
yes.
Talking to them as well, because they would have been in and out of the house with your dad because of his position.
That's absolutely right, yes.
Who did you admire then as a very young child?
I became a great admirer of Margaret Thatcher's in the 1979 election. So I wasn't very, very young.
So you were 10 years old?
I was 10,
yeah.
Yes. And my admiration for her continued and still does continue.
Why? I mean, it's quite surprising, isn't it, for a 10-year-old to admire Margaret Thatcher?
Well, she was very clear in what she thought, and she was on the side of the individual against the state. Whether I thought this through as carefully as that, I don't know, but you have to remember you do remember how badly things were going wrong in 1979 with the strikes, with things not being open, with placards abandoned around the street and all of that, and that she had a clear idea of how to improve things.
How privileged did you feel as a child? I mean, you may not have been aristocratic, but you were wealthy.
That's always a very hard question to look back on and answer directly, because you don't know as a child how other people live very directly. So it depends at what age. When you're 5, 6, 7, you assume that everybody lives like you, that everybody's father is the editor of the Times or whatever it happens to be. It's only as you get older that you realize the great good fortune that you have had. And so I probably realized that when I was a little bit older, but it would be hard to put a specific age on it. The realization that actually other people lead very different lives, and that I was very fortunate in the life that I led.
But by the time that you were sort of 9 and 10 and becoming interested in conservative politics and Margaret Thatcher, I mean, do you think you knew then?
I'm sure I realised by 10 or 11.
And how did that change the way you thought of your politics? I mean, that you were better off than most people.
Well, again, it's hard to say specifically because one's ideas evolve over time, and it's very easy to apply retrospectively what I know now to what I was thinking as a 9 and 10-year-old. And I probably didn't overthink it at that age. I'm sure I didn't overthink it at that age. But the lesson at that point was very clear that whatever the Labour Party said, people's lives were getting worse, that there was a real problem in the country in the late 70s, and that Margaret Thatcher had a programme for making that better and making everybody in the country better off. And I can now analyse it in much more clear political terms and give a better explanation of it, but I think that simple truth was what underlay what I was thinking.
And so when did the thought of running the country pop up in your mind?
Well, I've never had the thought of running the country and still don't.
Well, you must have it to some degree if you're a politician.
Well, being a Member of Parliament. When did I want to become a Member of Parliament? Again, it's difficult to be specific about it. I know that by the time I'd got to Oxford, I was interested in going into politics and becoming a Member of Parliament. But I'm not sure that I at that point knew precisely how you became a Member of Parliament. I was a member of the Conservative Party and I was active in student politics. It's different to think, wouldn't it be an interesting thing to do to become a Member of Parliament, an important thing to do, to working out how you actually apply for it, what the steps you need to take are.
But did you dream of changing the world?
I'm very interested in policy development and how the nation's future can be improved by changing policy. That is, if that's dreaming of changing the world, then yes, I think it's very important to be interested in the policies that will determine how the country is governed and can improve the standard of living of the British people.
And what did your father say to you as a boy when you would talk about these things? Would he say, well, you can do it, you can go and change the world, you can make the world a better place?
My father was always a great supporter of whatever his children wanted to do, and I'm one of five, and we're doing very different things, but whatever we wanted to do, my father was always enormously supportive. And therefore, yes, he very much encouraged all of his children to have strong views and to be willing to express them.
What would be wrong with you saying, yes, I want to run things?
There would be nothing wrong with my saying that if that were the actual case. But
you don't want to run
I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. I think want to is the wrong word. I don't think people... I think if you look at Theresa May as an example of somebody in the job of Prime Minister, she does it because she has a clear sense of duty. And I think that's the right way to come to it, rather than thinking that this is something that I want and must conspire to get.
If it were thrust upon you, is that what you mean?
But nobody's going to thrust it upon me.
Well, they might, actually, because lots of people want you to lead the Conservative Party and become Prime Minister. So, I mean, it's perfectly possible that it could be thrust upon you in some way.
In the old way that the Speaker was dragged to the chair. But no, I think this is simply improbable, and that people will want somebody who has had high ministerial office in the eventuality that Theresa May decides she's done it for long enough. The issue really is, where do you have the ability to influence things in politics? How do you get the policies that you want adopted? And I think in truth there are a number of different ways of doing that. Obviously the leader of a party, a Prime Minister, has a very powerful position in getting policies adopted. But there are other ways of doing it, and one of the ways is to be involved in the debate and the argument, and to win the argument. It's not all about numbers. There's an important part that is about numbers, making sure you've got the support for the policies that you believe in, but it's also about ensuring that you win the intellectual argument. And I think my contribution is better made at that point than in a different role.
Right now.
And so I'm very happy with what I'm doing, and very happy to carry on supporting the Prime Minister. It's impossible to know what may happen 5 or 10 years from now, but I'm not looking at a career path towards the Prime Ministership. That is not my aim.
Because we're having this conversation the day after you've scored a major victory over the government with regard to Brexit, and your own colleagues are saying, well, who runs Britain, the Prime Minister or Jacob Rees-Mogg? So you have got a huge amount of power right now as a backbench MP.
Well, I think the people who were raising that question were people who aren't on the whole in favour of Brexit.
Anne Soubry and Heidi Allen and people like that.
But you're absolutely right. My strong ambition is that Brexit should be delivered and delivered properly and delivered in line with the commitments the Conservative Party has given. So I don't decry all ambition, but my ambition is for one of the most important policy changes in the country's modern history, which I think will be of enormous benefit to us. So that's an ambition. I'm more than happy to run up the flagpole, so to speak. But it's not about me personally. It's about ensuring that the right policy comes through.
But it is about, will the real Jacob Rees-Mogg stand up in a way? Because you have this modesty and...
well, I've got a lot to be modest about, as was said
about your ambitions, and yet you are steely in terms of the way you have steered the ERG to deliver what you want. You have this politeness, and yet, again, you are very determined about what you're trying to achieve politically, and your sort of detractors say, well, this is a front that enables him to actually, kick you in the shins underneath the table.
Well, I haven't done that, have
no,
I? Your shins are perfectly safe.
So, what do you feel upset when people characterise you as this, or or do you worry about being found out?
No. And, first of all, the ERG is a team, and it's not all about me, and that's crucially important. That there's a range of views within the ERG. Some people are much more tough-minded than I am. Some people are much more conciliatory than I am. And it's a balance of where that lies as to what the ERG can or cannot do. In terms of, do I mind what people say about me? Not a bit. No, I think that if you go into public life, you must expect that not everybody will like and admire you, and that's just the way it goes. It's
getting nastier, though, isn't it, for you? I mean, as things get more serious. I mean, you were this sort of lovable character up until very recently, and now you're much more controversial.
Well, I've always thought controversy is fun. There's good things, part of political life. I don't mind this in a bit. And it always surprises me how thin-skinned some politicians are. And I just don't think politics can be a good career if you really mind when people throw the odd verbal stone at you.
So you don't get offended?
No, of course not.
Ever?
Never, really. I mean, that this is political life, and I absolutely recognise that some people won't be my greatest supporters.
Right, let's get to Brexit properly then. Why is Brexit the issue on which you defined yourself, given there are so many that you could have done?
Well, ultimately it's about democracy, and therefore things flow from it. The question is, and was 2 years ago, can you change your government? And can you, by how you vote, lead to change in all forms of legislation within your country? And as long as we were in the European Union, the answer to that was no. And that the government was constrained and increasingly constrained in its areas of operation, and therefore how people voted mattered increasingly little. And so it all comes down to democracy, because that's how you change everything else. And it is interesting that 2.8 million people voted in the referendum who hadn't bothered voting before. And they felt suddenly it was worth voting. We've got a higher turnout in the referendum than in the election a year before. And you saw the same with the Scottish referendum.
Isn't that alarming, though, in a way as well? I mean, you can say this is a really important 3 million people, or you can say this is a minority who took a massive decision for the rest of us.
No, because the result was 17.4 million people voting in favour. But there were nearly 3 million...
Against 16 point something.
Yeah, but there were nearly 3 million people who thought this is now really important. We can make a difference. Our vote will count. And I think that's very powerful for democracy. And you saw the same with the Scottish referendum. You saw enormous turnout, the highest turnout since the 1950s in the Scottish referendum, because people thought this really mattered. And I've always felt that with election turnouts, it's the question of whether the politicians can inspire the electorate, not whether or not the electorate can't be bothered to vote.
But it's interesting, given you said everything about going to Fife as a young candidate. You see people struggling with their health, with their income, with their children, with the elderly parents, and all those sorts of things, often struggling to put food on the table still in this country. Yet, as an issue to take on for yourself, you took on this big question of sovereignty and Europe.
But you mentioned food. The average tariff on food imports is 23%, and the non-tariff barriers mean that it's really very difficult to import food.
But there were easier ways to tackle this
than
going for the big institutional change.
There's absolutely nothing we could do about that tariff without leaving the European Union.
Not that tariff. I mean about people's ability to put food on the table.
No, but you challenge me on the cost of living, And I'm saying to you, actually, the European Union was putting up the cost of living for people in this country who are the least well off. And that taking back control means that we can change that, which is really important. And that it's no good saying that we want people to have a better standard of living unless you've got a practical way of going about it. And the European Union was lowering the standard of living of my constituents.
But it is possible that Brexit will also lower the standard of living for many people, isn't it?
No. It's extraordinarily unlikely.
It's not extraordinarily unlikely.
I can't think why you would think it is likely to happen.
Huge numbers of business leaders are warning that there could be complete chaos, that business will come to a standstill, manufacturing will stop, because all those just-in-time factories won't be able to get their materials in.
We'll carry on as we are.
How can we carry on as we are when the rules have all changed?
Because it will be under our control. We will say...
So we will just say, OK, fine, we're not going to enforce any rules.
We won't have any new rules at that point. The whole point of the withdrawal bill is that the rules will be the same the day after we've left as they are the day before we've left, and that therefore we will be completely entitled and secure in saying that goods produced in Germany that were safe on the 29th of March are safe on the 30th of March. You see, this is where Project Fear has got quite hysterical. The idea that we will close our borders as a voluntary act of self-harm.
Not close our borders, but we'll suddenly have a border. We'll suddenly have a hard border in Northern Ireland. We'll suddenly have a hard border
in Northern Ireland,
where it's our responsibility to check things.
Who is imposing this?
We'll have to decide not to, is my point. You know.
No, I think it's the other way around. We'd have to decide to. We would have to decide to do acts of self-harm. And Mr. Varadkar is not going to build a wall between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
What about the other way?
What about traffic going the other way?
Do you think the European Union will just decide not to enforce anything or not to bring in any checks?
The EU has said it will not impose a hard border in Ireland. It's made that clear. The checks they impose on goods going to the European Union will have to be in line with WTO standards. And that's how we trade with the whole of the rest of the world.
But they will want to check, won't they?
Well, that'll be a matter for them.
So there will be chaos at the border going one way at the very least.
But that's going to be a matter for the European Union. But what you were saying was hold on, you said manufacturing would grind to a halt. But it won't, because we will be able to carry on importing goods. We'll be able to carry on with just-in-time deliveries.
It's not the view of most big manufacturing bosses in Britain.
Just-in-time deliveries come through Southampton from the rest of the world. It's perfectly possible to have just-in-time deliveries in non-EU trade. Poor old Airbus got rather caught out. It was admitted by somebody speaking anonymously from the company that they'd come out in support of the government's policy because they'd expected to get a big chunk of business from the Ministry of Defence. Then they didn't get it and they were furious.
It's not just Airbus, though. It's huge numbers of big manufacturers. The CBI were in last week saying, look, there are loads of people like Airbus. They're too scared to come forward because they're worried about losing business. But there are lots of people
The CBI said the same would happen if we didn't join the euro. The CBI's track record on this is dreadful.
So you just don't believe them?
I don't believe the CBI. The EU funded CBI. I think people who are against Brexit see all sorts of potential bogeymen that are fanciful.
How sure are you? Do you ever worry that you might just be wrong?
It is always possible that anybody could be wrong.
Have you ever been wrong before?
Of course I've been wrong on things.
Yet you seem very, very sure of this.
Well, I think you need to work it through logically and see what the likely risks are.
You are in the minority, though. I mean, when it comes to the voice of business, the majority of them think that a cliff-edge Brexit, a hard Brexit, would be very bad for Britain.
There are a lot of business voices that have backed leaving. There was Business for Britain.
Not nearly as many, though. I mean, it is a minority, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it depends what type of businesses you're looking at. I think you often see that established vested interests want things to stay as they are.
you can call them vested interests.
Yeah, I will call them vested
in a pejorative way. But they're at the end of the day, they're businesses, and they're the people who employ people in Britain.
But it's really
and
interesting
they're good,
how the people who seem to welcome Brexit are the entrepreneurs, people who've set up their own businesses. And why is that? Well, I think it's because the EU is not a very competitive-based organisation. And Airbus is a great example because it's had enormous government subsidies from EU nations. And therefore, of course, it wants the current setup. It's very heavily dependent upon it.
But there are thousands of jobs in Britain that depend on it. So you can attack Airbus, but at the end of the day, they are massive employers.
Yes.
And their supply chain is hugely significant as well. So it's tens of thousands of jobs.
And so where's Airbus going to make its wings?
Like it might, wherever it wants. I mean, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. The point is, it might not be here anymore.
This would be billions of pounds worth of investment.
And they've said they'll need to
And
look at
it's
it.
threatened the same before. Said it over the euro.
But it's not just business and the CBI. It's Theresa May and Philip Hammond. Are they all just making this up?
Well, it's very interesting that Chequers' arrangement was entirely backed by people who backed Remain 2 years ago, and opposed during the discussions by people who had been in favour of leave. And so you did have the old arguments being rehashed.
It says something about your view of your political colleagues that you think they will just say something that isn't true. I mean, do you think they're just making this up?
No.
Including the Prime Minister?
No. I think...
Who you support?
I do indeed. But I think they believe these arguments to be correct, and I think that the evidence shows that they are not correct. It's really interesting to look at what Andy...
But you think their judgment is wrong?
What Andy Haldane has been saying about economic forecasting, he made a very good speech from about 18 months ago on the difficulties of economic forecasting and where it goes wrong and how hard it is for economic forecasting to see turning points. And I think there is an issue with this, that leaving the European Union is a major turning point and is the point at which economic forecasting is at its weakest.
If you're wrong and the economy does take a hit next year, what will you do? I mean, will you feel honour bound to resign?
What can I resign from? I mean, I'm
well, as an MP.
Backbench member of Parliament. This will be a choice for the electorate. The electorate ultimately will be the judge of this and will decide whether Brexit has been a success or a failure.
But you're a man of honour and duty. I mean, would you feel that there was something incumbent upon you rather than leave it to voters?
We've just discussed that I may not know for years to come whether it is...
well, we'll know by the end of next year whether the economy's taken a downturn. I mean...
Well, but you're getting into really complex areas there, as you know perfectly well.
I mean, I'm just talking about simple things like GDP and employment. I mean, if those things go down next year, you'll be wrong.
Not necessarily.
Well, you said there wouldn't be a problem.
Caused by Brexit. But there are still...
maybe because of something else.
Well, what happens if there's a coup in China and the Chinese economy completely collapses? That won't be the fault of Brexit. So it's not as simple as you're saying.
All things being equal, but we will know roughly whether there's been a Middle East crisis or a Chinese coup. Let's assume there hasn't been a Chinese coup.
Okay, but we discussed 5 minutes ago that all things aren't equal.
Well, if you're saying, you could get to next year and you get to the end of March and then things go like that and there's something else that happened in March that you could blame it on.
I think leaving the European Union is going to be the greatest opportunity economically for this country.
And I'm asking you, what if you're wrong? What would be the consequence if you're wrong?
Well, I've accepted that anybody can be wrong.
Yeah. Why won't you say it, though? I mean, you don't think you're wrong, so why don't you say, if I'm wrong, I'll resign?
Because you're proposing a very simple question on a very complex set of circumstances. You're making the other things being equal argument when we discussed earlier that other things never are.
We will broadly know whether the cause of the economic downturn is Brexit or not.
We will know at some point, yes, of course we will, but it's a question of timescale. And
so how long have you got?
We won't know the full economic consequences for a very long time.
Come on.
We really won't.
Of course not, but I mean, we'll have an indication. We'll know whether there's been chaos. We'll know whether there have been job losses.
The overwhelming opportunity for Brexit is over the next 50 years. It's not over...
Is that how long you've got?
No, I'll be dead by then. I'm not anticipating living to 99, which is what I will be in 50 years' time.
Really? Well, you probably will.
Well, we shall see. Time will tell. I doubt I will still be a member of Parliament, but nothing's impossible.
It's very interesting that you don't seem to be prepared to put your own future on the line when you're prepared to put everybody else's futures on the line.
As an elected member of Parliament, your future is on the line at every election. I shall have a great responsibility. But the advantages of Brexit, I happen to think, will come through relatively quickly. That what the government ought to do on day one, on the day we leave, is remove all tariffs on any goods that we don't produce. An immediate cut in costs to people's budgets. That would be a fantastic Brexit dividend on day one. Will the government do that?
How much would it cost?
Oh, the cost would be negligible.
What would we lose in tariffs?
Because the tariffs that we raise are, about £3 billion a year, and those go to the European Union in the first place. Other than 20% we keep for our cost of collection. So this is, on day one, no direct cost to us, and most of these high tariffs, most of the high tariffs on goods that we don't produce mean that none of those goods come in.
So what else are you saying the government should do straight away?
I'm saying on day one, you say any goods we don't produce in this country to any scale, we are removing all of the tariff. And that suddenly cuts the cost of goods for people. So you can do things, and you see this perhaps ties into your question. It slightly depends how the government responds, which will not be under my control.
Well,
if the government does really exciting and positive things, then there's a great opportunity. Then Brexit will do extremely well. That there is an alternative that the government decides, which I think would be utter madness, and I don't see the government doing it, to put the common external tariff on European goods, which would be very harmful.
Just to come back to what I was saying before about your lack of trust in the judgment of people in government. If you think Theresa May and Philip Hammond are so wrong about Brexit in their judgment, why should we think that they're right about anything else?
I think the Prime Minister's judgment on Brexit is
wrong.
Is not one that I share. She has concerns that I don't have, and that has become the view of her cabinet. I think the Chancellor has been.
But these are not matters of principle. These are matters of economic judgment. You just think she's got the economics wrong. And if she's got the economics wrong on that, then how do we know? Why do you think she's right about anything else?
Well, I think people can be wrong in one area and right on lots of other areas.
This is the big one, isn't it? This is the most important political thing in your lifetime.
This is more than my lifetime. I mean, I think that the Brexit decision is one of the fundamental decisions in the British Constitution's history, and that people will look back on this in decades to come and will see what a remarkable change in our constitutional settlement it has been, and that in a way is the great issue, is the constitutional effect, the taking back of control, and the complication, I suppose, between the fear that they have in the Treasury about short-term economic consequences and the long-term opportunity for the country if we get economic policy making right once we've left. I happen to disagree with them on the short-term consequences. I think they've concentrated too little on the long-term consequences.
Who would you like to see running the country, if not you?
I'm supporting Theresa May. I haven't...
A woman who you think is wrong about the biggest issue for hundreds of years.
Well, the party decided to support her as leader 2 years ago because they thought that it would be helpful for the country to have somebody who had backed Remain and then decided to accept the Leave result. I think that has a logic to it.
Do you not find it frustrating that our system of party politics means that you can't give me an honest answer to this? Because if you do, there'll be all sorts of headlines about Jacob Rees-Mogg plotting against Theresa May. It's a shame, isn't it?
I'm not supporting anybody other than Mrs. May.
If I asked you the question that Donald Trump answered, I mean, do you think Boris Johnson would make a great Prime Minister?
Yes, he would be. Yes, of course I could say that. I backed Boris Johnson in the leadership campaign 2 years ago because I thought he would be a great Prime Minister.
And do you still think he'd be a great Prime Minister?
I think Boris is absolutely terrific. But I think the Conservative Party is very fortunate that it has a vast number of very able people who would make wonderful Prime Ministers.
Would you ever stand against Boris?
We've tried discussing that before.
It's a straight question, yes or no?
Would
you stand against
There isn't an election. I'm not advocating a particular candidate. I'm just saying that there are lots of able people within the party. But
if he were to stand, I'm asking you, would you stand? Or would you throw your weight behind him, as you did before?
We haven't reached a leadership contest. The Prime Minister has the support of the party.
Don't you think this is what's wrong with politics, though? You can't give me a straight answer to that question.
You're asking me questions about things that are entirely speculative.
All politics is speculative. It's all about what's going to happen in the future. That's all speculation.
But I can't predict these things. I've already said that I think I am not a candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party. But what you're trying to get me to say is that I'm supporting Boris as opposed to Theresa May, which is not the case. I'm supporting the Prime Minister. She has my support. I'm not trying to get a new person to take over from her. I'm not conspiring to do that. I'm not interested in doing that.
I wasn't asking you that, actually. I was asking you whether you think you'd be better than Boris.
Boris is a former Foreign Secretary. Boris has been a Mayor of London. Boris is obviously more qualified to do it.
Can we talk about how Brexit was delivered? Do you think immigration was used at all as a dog whistle issue to appeal to racists to vote for Brexit?
I hope not. There were two campaigns, as you know. There was Vote Leave and Leave.eu.
And you had close links with UKIP before. I mean, you suggested a link-up, didn't you?
I suggested the coalition, and I know Nigel Farage, but I wasn't linked to the Leave.eu campaign. I think the issue was taking back control, and in the very many public meetings I did, that was what I found people were concerned about. And I think the immigration question is very interesting in this context, because when recently it was suggested we shouldn't allow in 1,000 doctors, everybody said, no, that's completely ridiculous, that we need 1,000 doctors. And it's about that sense of control, not either numbers or even particularly the European Union. And that was the impression I got at the meetings I addressed. Can I speak for other people? No, I can't.
But do you think something was unleashed, is the question? You know, that there was a nastiness, there was an undercurrent within that immigration argument that made even people like me feel a little unwelcome for a while. Second-generation immigrants, you know, we encountered racial abuse for the first time in decades.
I'm very sorry to hear that. I think that was not part of the campaign. I don't think that was an intended part of the campaign in any sense. And
no, I know it wasn't intended, but the question is, was something unleashed? You know, were you prepared to take those people to have on your side, even though you don't necessarily think what they think?
No, I'm not in the least bit interested in having the support of racists.
Do you think that was the Vote Leave position as well?
I'm sure.
And the Leave.eu position?
I mean, you must ask them, because...
What about that Nigel Farage poster with all the refugees? What did you think of that?
I think the posters were unsuitable for a campaign.
Do you think they were racist?
I think they were unpleasant. I think... You see, one of the reasons I want to leave the EU is that I would still like to take more Syrian refugees. But it's about control. And I think people fleeing in fear of their lives deserve a higher priority than what you may want to call economic migrants. I don't think being an economic migrant is not a noble thing to do. I think it is, actually. I think it's a very understandable thing to do, and that people who move around the world to improve their standard of living and that of their families are doing something that Conservatives should welcome and admire. I think it's a very Conservative thing to do. But
that wasn't the tone of the immigration debate, was it? The tone was economic migrants come here to sponge.
Which they don't. They come here to work very hard. I said this in countless debates during the referendum and since, that we ought to have the greatest admiration for people who are willing to up sticks, move hundreds of miles to a country where they do not speak the language, work hard, send money back to the families from whom they very often separated themselves, to give their families a better start in life and a better standard of living.
I know that's what you said. There's also a question, though, of who else you deal with. I mean, you had links to Nigel Farage, you met Steve Bannon, you went to that dinner with the Traditional Britain group that was very controversial.
One or two of those people turned out to be absolutely revolting. I had no idea about that. I had a call the day before the dinner to say allegations had been made about them years ago, and I couldn't find any information on these allegations. I spoke to Central Office, who knew nothing about the organisation.
Why didn't you listen to the warnings from Searchlight? Had you not heard of Searchlight? I mean, they're a very well-known organisation.
I just got it wrong.
Yeah.
I just got it wrong. And, I'd accepted an invitation. They had sold out. I felt an obligation to people who'd bought their tickets to go to dinner, and I didn't have sufficient evidence But this was a mistake.
But you see what I'm saying? I mean, you've courted Farage, you've sat down with Steve Bannon, who now goes around advising far-right groups around Europe. You know, people might say, well, you know, yes, Jacob Rees-Mogg says very honourable things about immigration, but if you look at the people he deals with, they're not as pleasant.
In terms of meeting Steve Bannon, I've met the Russian ambassador, and his country goes around killing people in the United Kingdom. I mean, if you are in political life, you meet other political figures. That's just the way it is, and it's interesting to meet other political figures and to hear what they've got to say. That doesn't make me any more linked to Steve Bannon than I am to the Russian ambassador.
Do you find him as unpleasant a prospect?
The Russian ambassador was absolutely charming.
No, I mean what they represent.
As you would expect. Steve Bannon and I are not in the same political party or envelope. He has very different views from mine, and he phrases himself in a way that I would not phrase myself.
I mean, he says, if they call you a racist, wear it as a badge of honour.
But that is not something I would say.
Is he not beyond the pale?
You've got to meet people in political life. He was the President of the United States' closest advisor.
Is anyone beyond the pale?
It depends on their role, doesn't it? I mean, I think that President Trump was right to meet President Putin. That this government had dealings with Robert Mugabe. We had Ceausescu to dinner. That actually you don't choose who the leading figures in foreign countries are, and you have to deal with them. And I think I don't think Nigel Farage is a racist. One name that you raised that I hadn't replied on. I think he wants the country to govern itself, but I don't think there's any evidence that he is a racist.
But were all those people prepared to take the support of racists to be on their side, you know, to mobilise them? And that's what dog whistle politics is. It's not, you know, it's not saying, you know, any particular individual holds a view, but, you know, they'll say the right things in order to mobilise them.
I think if they had done that, Brexit would have lost by miles, because nobody else would have voted to leave. I just don't think the country is racist, and that the reason I don't think that was a strategy is because it would have been such a stupid and unpleasant strategy and would have alienated millions and millions of voters who wouldn't hold those views.
And when you say the country isn't racist, do you mean at all? I mean, do you think there's a tiny minority?
Yeah, it's a tiny minority.
How many? I mean, would you put a percentage on how many people in Britain are racist?
No, I wouldn't. These things are very hard to know, but they do mass observation surveys which indicate that there is nowadays very little racism in this country.
And so what do you think is the relationship between racism and being anti-immigration?
I think the two are completely separate. As it happens, I think European Union immigration is basically racist because it's European immigration and it keeps out people from the rest of the world. If
you were one of those Indians, Pakistanis or Africans who voted for Brexit because you thought you'd get a fairer immigration system and it would be easier to get your family and friends into the country, are they going to get that?
It should certainly be fairer.
Will there be more of them?
I would have thought there would be more proportionately, but I wouldn't like...
But that doesn't mean anything, does it? I mean, that just means there are fewer Europeans.
Okay. I think there'll be more proportionately. I wouldn't like to promise because this will be a decision that will be made year by year.
Do you think there should be?
But can I just give the example before I come to that of Australia, where once they'd taken control of their immigration policy, the number of immigrants actually went up. And it's about ensuring that everybody's comfortable with it and that you treat people fairly.
So do you think that's possible here, that immigration will go up?
I doubt it will go up immediately because I think part of the taking back control is that people feel that there was too much in too short a period. But I think control over the longer term ought to lead to a more friendly system of immigration policy. And I hope we will drop the hostile environment policy, which I do not like.
Were you appalled by that? I mean, you came and did our debate, and I sat watching your face as people told these heartbreaking stories, and you seemed very surprised.
I was absolutely shocked. I think it's against everything this country stands for. See, I think very, very strongly that anybody who has a British passport is as British as I am. It's not a question of whether you were born here or whether your family's lived here forever. You're a British citizen, and you are entitled to all the rights and respects of a British citizen the moment you've got that passport, and all the protections that that brings, and all the freedoms that that brings. And one of our great freedoms is that when we're going about our lawful business, we don't have to prove to anybody else or an agent of the state who we are. That's one of our most precious freedoms. And the idea that people from immigrant communities were treated as if they had to prove who they were, I thought was disgraceful.
I haven't really talked about morality in this interview because it's probably another programme, but you are famously driven by your Catholic faith. You're anti-abortion, you were anti-gay marriage. If you were in power, are these things that you would want to legislate about, or would you see it as your duty to deliver what you think the majority want?
I would not legislate for these things because they are a free vote, and rightly so. Rightly, I come under no pressure to follow a party line on these issues, and I would not wish to apply a party line to others. But I think you need to accept what society, well, accept is the wrong word. You want the church to preach what its view is. You hope that people may accept that. But you can't legislate for it effectively.
You seek to persuade.
You seek to persuade. But not by law, not by imposition, not by penalties, because the history of moral legislation is that it's simply ineffective.
But you don't go seeking to persuade on these issues, do you?
No, I leave that to the clergy, but they have my support in doing that. But no, I'm a secular politician, and my job really is to discuss income tax rather than to discuss morality. Has
your morality shifted at all? I mean, are your views on homosexuality different now to how they were 20 years ago?
Well, the teaching of the church is very constant. I very much like the approach Pope Francis takes in reminding us all that God is a merciful God and that God's mercy is infinite. And that is something with which all one's moral judgments should be strongly tempered.
Do you think homosexuality is a sin? It's not about what you think, I know.
It's the teaching of the church.
So you believe it is what I mean.
The teaching of the church is it's in the catechism. But what Pope Francis said is that it's not for me to judge, and if it's not for him to judge, it's clearly not for me to judge. So it's not for me to judge other people, but people can read the Catholic Catechism, and they will then know in their own lives what is and is not sinful.
Do you have gay friends?
I don't ask my friends about their private lives. That's a matter for them. And I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I don't categorise my friends. I don't try and tick a box with friends to try and...
No, but you know whether your friends are black, white or blue, Conservative or Labour.
I've got a wide range of friends. I've got a wide range of friends, but as I say, I don't judge my friends, and therefore I don't sort of categorise them.
I ask all my guests on this programme what they think their most controversial or difficult to deliver way of changing the world is. Do you have one?
So many of my views are controversial and difficult that it's an almost endless list. Look, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, it would have been Brexit. And that's now coming to fruition. I think one deeply controversial and difficult to deliver view is perhaps sufficient.
And if you deliver it, or if you help to deliver it, can you imagine any point in staying in politics after that? I mean, once you do something so immense, isn't that it? I mean, doesn't everything else pale into insignificance?
That's a very good question. Should I retire to Somerset and at this time of year spend more time deadheading the races?
Is it tempting?
It is. Somerset is such a wonderful place to be. It's always tempting to from childhood. On Sunday evenings, I found it difficult to drag myself back from Somerset to London. One always prefers to stay in Somerset, and there's no greater excitement than driving back down to Somerset for the weekend. Even if as an MP it's a working weekend, nonetheless there is a draw and attraction of a busy life that means that I probably wouldn't want to do it indefinitely.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.